I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, here on Israel News Talk Radio. Normally on this show, I try not to cover the same stuff that other shows cover. I try to be a little original and unique in the stuff that we talk about. But today is going to be a little different. And the reason today is going to be a little different is because there's only one topic we could talk about. And that is the unfortunate, horrific events that happened just a few days ago at Meron during Lag BaOmer. We have to talk about it. And why do we have to talk about it? Because there is a lot of talk happening. I've been reading a lot. I've been watching a lot. I've been hearing a lot. And I've been sickened to my stomach on some of the stuff I've been hearing. And I want to talk about how sad it is that this happened, but how angry we have to be that this happened. You see, we could be very sad and very angry at the same time. And I'm very sad. I know the family of at least one of the people who got killed, and I know there are plenty of people who know many of the people who were killed or their families. And I know that this death could have been avoided. These deaths could have been avoided. You know, when it's a terror attack, it's one thing. A terror attack, we could say, it's random, it happens, and there's nothing we could do to stop it. But with this event, there was plenty that could have been done to stop it. There has been many, many years of warnings, of reports, of discussions about how to avoid a tragedy at Mount Meron. And they've all been ignored, pushed under the table, put there to appease people. We'll talk about this and a whole lot more. We're live. You could call in, and you could join me in the chat room at IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. The numbers are on the top of the page on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to talk to you about this. We're going to take a little break. When we come back, I want to discuss how angry I am and how angry you should be. Joey Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. You could join me in the chat room at israelnewstalkradio.com. You could call in. The numbers to call in North America, 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 026500-151. So 45 people died celebrating Lag BaOmer on Mount Meron on Thursday night, Friday morning. They died not because a terrorist entered the site and committed some horrific terror attack that did not happen. They weren't taken by God in a golden chariot, as some people have claimed. They weren't punished for the sins of the Jewish people, as other people have claimed. They died due to the negligence of many people, and people should be held accountable for their actions which led to these deaths. Now, it's outrageous that 45 people, mostly teenagers and people in their young 20s, had to die in order for public safety to be looked at. You have a public event where 100,000 people show up. Safety protocols should be in place, and it was quite apparent that they weren't. Now, there were heroes and there are villains. And in a black and white world, we could say there are heroes, there are villains, and we could differentiate between heroes and villains. But in this case here, the heroes were some of the people who died sacrificing their lives to save others. I've heard of at least 2 or 3 stories of people in the crowd who went to save children, younger children, children saving younger children, who ended up being crushed to death while they saved the lives of others. And these people should be celebrated because they were brave. But as we continue and the news cycle continues, we realize that, as in most cases, we will never remember the names of the dead. Those names seem to fade off into history. And because there's no perpetrator of the crime, there's no terrorist, we're not going to remember the name of a terrorist. And this whole event in a few weeks will be forgotten by the news cycles. Newspapers will have forgotten it already. It's already on the back pages of newspapers and on the bottom of the websites. And in a day or two, it won't even appear. And it will be as if this event didn't happen. And that's outrageous. 45 people died because the government didn't do their job. 45 people died because religious leaders didn't do their job. 45 people died because nobody cared. Now, I know it's harsh. It's a harsh thing to say, and I know people are going to get upset with me for saying these things. That nobody cared. Of course people cared. Nobody wanted anyone to die, people are going to argue. And people have argued with me. I've had this conversation a couple of times in the last couple of days. That nobody wanted anybody to die. Chas v'shalom. God forbid anybody should die. Nobody wanted anybody to get hurt. But they wanted to make sure that there were enough space. They wanted to make sure that enough people came in to celebrate, to make it a huge celebration at the grave of Rav Shimon ben Yochai. And then disaster happened. And they said disaster could happen anywhere. It's not specific to this event. Disaster could happen anywhere, and you can't blame anybody. It was the will of God, they tell me. The will of God. Wow, that's quite a statement, if you ask me. Sure, God creates everything, and God and God decides who lives and who dies. We understand that, and God makes the decisions on how long we live and what kind of life we live. We understand that. And God also trusts that we are going to protect each other, and we are going to ensure that we don't harm each other or harm ourselves intentionally or unintentionally. That we will be careful, that we'll watch out for ourselves and for each other, that we will take care of one another. The will of God is one thing, But gross negligence is something else. So, God gave us the freedom of choice. So, the will of God is there, but the freedom of choice is there too. For instance, God could have granted me 100 years to live. And sure, I have that 100 years. I could live that 100 years. And if I take care of myself and I watch myself, I could live 100 years. But if tomorrow I decide to walk onto the street and jump in front of a bus, then I'm robbing myself of the years that God gave me. Now, if I'm a bus driver and I have a full bus of people and I drive that bus into a wall and blow the bus up, then I'm robbing everybody else of those years that God gave them. So premature death is something totally unrelated to the will of God. And death by negligence is definitely unrelated to the will of God, even for religious people. Now, religious people will say, well, the negligence was the will of God. I mean, we could use a circular logic all the time. And the deflection from assigning blame to people, and the deflection from understanding that this was a completely avoidable situation is sickening to me. Now, some may say I'm a heretic. That's fine. You could call me whatever you want. I'll call myself what you want to call me. I will address the issue right away. You could call me a heretic. You could say that I have no idea what I'm talking about. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. Because for at least 20 years, probably even more, there have been warnings about the Lag BaOmer gathering on Mount Meron. There have been warnings about the size of the crowd. In fact, reports for this year, reports say that initially the public health authorities wanted 9,000 people on the mountain this year. They didn't want more than 9,000 people. And their mind was changed by Aryeh Deri, the head of Shas. So 100,000 people showed up. That's quite a difference, right? 9,000 people, 100,000 people. It's quite a difference in the amount of people. Now, I've listened to interviews of survivors of the crush in the one exit that had the problem. And they were quite clear that they were exiting the event because there were way too many people there. They felt that the situation was getting out of hand. Even standing there, they felt the situation getting out of hand. Now, I know, you could tell me, I know, that every year there's 500,000 people that show up on Mount Meron in a space that could theoretically only hold 25,000 people. 500,000 people show up every year. This year was a little less. And 500,000 people, they show up and there's never a tragedy. Nothing ever happens. This is an argument I've heard too. And I know. They were lucky for so many years that nothing like this has happened before. Very, very lucky. It doesn't mean that it was right. There's a concept in Judaism, a concept that we have to discuss. The concept is called saving people's lives. It's called pikuach nefesh, protecting life. This concept means that when you have a situation where a life is in danger, it's your obligation to save that life. And it's your obligation to do it. That's it. You have to save life. We have to do whatever we could do to save somebody's life. The organizers of this event, the religious leaders that were running the event, the government officials that had to greenlight the event, especially during this COVID year where everything is being restricted, the people in charge went to inspect the site. We know this because they tell us that they went to inspect the site. The exit that caused the problem that these people died in was a relatively newly constructed exit. And there were warning signs that were put up. They didn't put the physical signs. There were warning signs before the event. They were talking about how dangerous this exit was and how maybe it's not built properly and how maybe it could be a danger. But then they ignored their own warnings. The controller had a report. They ignored their report. So one has to wonder, who could be held responsible for this event? For these deaths? Who could be held responsible for the lives of the 45 people? Who should be held responsible? That's the question. Do we hold religious leaders responsible because they didn't ensure that all the exits were safe? But then you could say the religious leaders were relying on the government and the police to ensure that all the exits were safe. Could you blame the police for not controlling the crowd? But I mean, if it was an overflow crowd, perhaps, maybe, they were stuck. Who do you blame? Give me a call. In North America, 301-768-4841. In Israel, 0265-00151. You could join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. Who should be held accountable for the disaster, for the deaths of 45 people, mostly children, at Mount Meron? Who should be held responsible for this? When we come back from the break, I want to talk about two specific stories that came up over the last week of people in the crowd who tried to help, who died helping other people. We'll talk about that when we come back from this break. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman on Israel News Talk Radio. Give me a call. We're live. I'm Howie Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. So, who are we going to blame? Who should be blamed for the deaths of 45 people at Mount Meron on Lag Bomer? Who should be blamed? I'm leaning towards the politicians more than the police. If the story is true that Aryeh Deri changed the public health recommendations and allowed 100,000 people rather than 9,000 people there, I mean, maybe he should be blamed a little bit. I know there were 500,000 people there last year and 2 years ago and 3 years ago, and they never had a problem. And for the last, who knows how many years, there have been hundreds of thousands of people who have gone there, and there was never a problem. But now, it always takes a death. It always takes somebody getting hurt to for people to take a look and say, "Hey, wait a second, there's something wrong here." It always takes some kind of crazy experience, something to happen, before people finally say, "Hey, okay, we have to take a look and we have to fix something." It's very unfortunate. You don't get a alarm system until you get robbed. You don't buy insurance until something happens. Now that we have 45 deaths, 45 dead people, maybe it's time to take a look at this situation and say, maybe 100,000 people in an area that's supposed to that could hold maximum 25,000 people is a crazy thing to do. Maybe 500,000 people in that same area is even crazier. Maybe it's time to start taking a look and trying to figure out if we could maybe try to save lives in the future. So now I know for sure, I know 100% that the exit at this problem happening is going to be demolished. They're going to rebuild it, and they're going to say it's safe. Take a look how safe it is. They're going to do that. I know that. And I know that for 100% that there'll be an inquiry, and they'll find that the problem wasn't really with the administration. It wasn't really with the police. The problem was more with people slipping on this ramp, on the slippery ramp. And that's what caused the disaster, and so nobody will be held accountable, and everybody will go home and sleep. Except for these 45 people and their families who will suffer. Well, the 45 people are dead, and their families will suffer forever. That we know is going to happen. I mean, that's what happens in most countries in cases like this. That's what happens. So there were two stories that stood out to me for of people who died in the event, who died trying to save other people. One of those stories was a school teacher who had come with a couple of with a student and his son, and he had lost control of his kids. His kids had been separated from him, and unfortunately both died. And he was offered to be pulled out of the crowd, and he said, no, not me, take the kids. And he pushed some kids there to be pulled out of the crowd. Now that doesn't seem very heroic when you think about it on a small scale, but on a large scale, when you know that people are dying, and he put his life in danger to save other people. And there were two stories like that. There was one story where he survived, and one story where the guy died. When you think that these people put their lives on the line to save other people, knowing that other people were being crushed and suffocating to death, these are heroes, and they should be celebrated as heroes. There were two yeshiva boys, and I heard it today. It was at one of the shiva houses. I heard the story, and in fact, it was reflected on the other side, at another shiva house. I heard the same story on two different shiva houses. The story was that these two yeshiva boys were standing there, and there was a 8-year-old boy who was suffocating. He couldn't breathe. There were too many people closed in on him, and he was being crushed, and he was being suffocated. And these boys shielded this 8-year-old boy with their bodies. They got around him, and they made kind of a tent with their arms and shielded this 8-year-old boy with their bodies. And the 8-year-old boy survived. His father's legs were broken, but his father survived, and he survived. But the two yeshiva boys were killed. The 21-year-old boy and a 17-year-old boy. They were killed. And you think about death by heroism, sacrificing yourself to save somebody else. And when we talk about this concept of saving others' lives, this is the ultimate way to do it. To sacrifice yourself to save somebody else is the ultimate way to do it. You can't do things that are greater than that. And to die a hero is amazing. I'd prefer not to die a hero, to be honest. And I'd prefer if nobody died a hero. But if you're going out, that's the way to go out, saving somebody else. But they should have never been in this position to start with. This should never have happened. Religious leaders should have encouraged less people to come to the event. 500,000 people on a normal basis was way too much, and everybody knew it. 100,000 people at the event was way too much, and everybody knew it. So either the religious leaders should have had shifts and different times for people to come and go, or there should have just been a limit. So religious leaders are partly to blame because they just stood there, and they encouraged more and more people to come to the event, which, by the way, is traditional. It's a traditional event. It's not a religious event. It's not an event that is prescribed by religious law. It's a traditional event that happens every year. It's more of a spiritual event than a religious event. So the religious leaders that encourage so many people to come should be held accountable. They should be held accountable because it's pretty negligent, and the danger is always lurking there. The government should definitely be held accountable for this. They had reports going back at least 15 years saying that the events at Mount Meron were dangerous and that eventually something's going to happen and somebody's going to get hurt. And those reports, year after year, were filed away, as reports tend to be, put away, and not heard from again. So here we are. This has happened. And where do we go from here? And that's the question everyone's asking. Where do you go from here? Do you hold an event like this again next year? Do you cancel the event and say, listen, okay, we had a tragedy, and so we're not going to do this anymore? Do you alter the event and allow less people to come? What do you do? How do you fix the problem? Now, for the 45 people and their families, the problem could never be fixed. This is a permanent problem. These people are gone. Children have lost their parents. Parents have lost their children. Grandchildren have lost their grandparents. Students have lost their teachers and their classmates. The ripple effect of the death of these 45 people is large. The people affected, there's a lot of people affected. The sadness is great, and people affected all over the world. And the sadness is great around the world. But level heads must prevail at the end. And emotions, as strong as they are and as horrific as they are, must be put aside, and practicality must be looked at. And while it is not important, absolutely not important, to post blame, although for closure, and to ensure that these things don't happen again, blame, at least against the authorities that were responsible for this, should be placed. We as a people have to heal, and we have to move on, of course, and we will, because we always do. But we must move on smarter. We must move on better. We must use this tragedy to better the system, to make the system better. We must use this tragedy, we must learn from this tragedy to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. This is the worst civilian tragedy in Israel in the history of the country. So we don't want to repeat this. We don't want a repeat of this. Now, going overboard, and this is what tends to happen too, it either goes two ways, that it gets brushed under the carpet and everyone forgets about it in a couple of weeks and we move on to something else. Or they go overboard with regulations and craziness. That's a possibility too, that happens. Going overboard probably is not the best option. But not doing anything is not the option either. So a balanced approach to how to react to this on a political level rather than an emotional level has to be fostered. Anger can't factor into it. Sadness can't factor into it. One has to look practically at the situation and say, okay, the politicians failed. The police failed. Religious leaders failed. The failure led to the death of 45 people. How do we change things to make it better? And that's what I want to talk about the next segment. How do we change things to make it better? How do we change things on a religious level? How do we change things on the political level and on the police level? How can we change things to make it better? How can we use this tragedy and make it better for other people? Give me a call if you have an idea. Numbers are 301-768-4841 or in Israel 0265000151. You could join me in the chat room on IsraelNewsTalkRadio.com. I'm Howie Silberger. This is Political Hitman. Howie Silberger, your political hitman, right here on Israel News Talk Radio. Give me a call in North America. Number is 301-768-4841. In Israel, the number is 0265000151. So we can't go back in time. We can't go back and change what happened. We can't bring back the people who have died. We can't change the situation for the families who have lost loved ones. We can't take away the sorrow and bring back happiness. It's not going to happen. It just can't be done. It's unfortunate, but we can't do it. Unfortunately, time goes forward. It doesn't go backwards. So what's happened has happened. Now, what I'm suggesting is that we have to learn the lessons from what happened, and we have to apply the lessons to the future. So we can't go back and change what happened. What we can do is go forward and change the future. That we can do. And so, how do we change the future? What do we do to change the future? What does that mean? How do you change the future? Well, to me, it is strict regulations. Uh, Now, I'm a law and order kind of guy, and I'm the kind of guy who likes regulations, and especially regulations that save lives and regulations that protect people. I'm big on that, and so for me, um, I think that strict regulations on how many people could come into the event and actually applying those regulations, regardless of the objections of the religious fervent people, aside from the objections from anybody, that a serious assessment of the area be taken, a serious decision be made on how many people could legally be held there, and then holding people accountable for allowing the illegal amount of people there at any given time. This should be the focus of the Israeli government after this tragedy. The second thing that should be looked at immediately is the safety of the entrances and the exits of the event. So, I mean, I've worked in public buildings my whole life. I've seen building inspections where they come into buildings and they look at buildings and they tell you, okay, this is how things should work, and this is how you have evacuation plans. You have safety plans. There's all sorts of plans in place for any eventuality. If something happens, there's plans in place. A safety plan, a safety evacuation plan, has to be put into place for an event that has 100,000 or 500,000 people. If you're going to allow that many people in there, a safety plan must be put into place, and people must be in place to apply and implement the safety plan to ensure that people get out safely if something, God forbid, happens. This is something that must be done, and it didn't seem like it was done in this case. Chaos reigned. If you watch the videos of what happened at Mount Meron, chaos, absolute chaos, and chaos in massive events should never, ever happen. The media was reporting it as a stampede. It wasn't really a stampede. It was more of a crush. It was a bottleneck. And a bottleneck crush is actually worse than a stampede. A stampede, when people start running in one direction, some people fall and get trampled, and that's one thing. But a bottleneck crush is totally different. I spoke to some people who were connected to some of the family members of people who were killed, and I was told, and I'm just going to share. I was told a lot of things, but some of the things are too gruesome to share, and I'm not going to share them. But the one thing that I am going to share because it just shows you how horrific this event was, is that some of the bodies that were found at the event were unidentifiable. You could look at them, you wouldn't tell who they were. They were so crushed, they were unidentifiable. I know of at least two bodies at least two, and there were probably more, but two people that I personally knew, or knew the families, or people who knew the families, were only identifiable through DNA testing. So that shows how much of a crush this was, how horrible it was for the people inside this bottleneck. And so the structure of the event, the structure of the physical structure of the event has to be looked at, and they have to come up with a better plan for evacuation, a better plan for exiting. It is absolutely crazy that chaos was allowed to reign, that chaos can happen like that. Now, accidents happen, and you can't avoid accidents. If the accidents happen, But this was more than an accident. If people slipped on the ramp and fell, that's fine. It happens. Unfortunately, people slip and they fall all the time. But it shouldn't have caused a domino effect that led to the death of 45 people. There should have been enough room at the front of the line, that they weren't crushed against a wall and the pressure from being crushed against the wall thrown backwards and crushing everybody else. That should never have happened. People moving forward, people moving backwards, and everybody getting killed. That should never, ever have happened. Another thing that has to be looked at is how governments treat reports. When inspectors give reports and say that this is a problem, how the government treats those reports. The controllers of the country said that there were at least 2 or 3 reports indicating that it was a dangerous situation at Mount Meron over the last few years. And the government took no action whatsoever to resolve this dangerous situation. Not taking action leads directly to the death of the people last week. So, the government must be held accountable for these deaths. They are the most accountable because they knew there was a problem, and knowing there's a problem and not doing something about the problem because you're afraid of religious backlash, you're afraid of public opinion going down, or whatever political reason they chose not to deal with the problem. Not dealing with the problem makes this more of a I was going to say more of a murder than an accidental death, because when governments know that there is a problem and the problem could lead to the maiming or death of somebody and don't do something, then they're culpable, just like anybody else is, for the deaths of these people. Well, I wouldn't say murder; I'd say more manslaughter, because they didn't really mean to kill people; they just didn't do anything to avoid it. So, I mean, the government has to be held accountable, and the people who ignored these warnings, the people who ignored these reports that were handed in year after year, saying there's a problem and that we have to look at this problem, we have to deal with this problem before somebody gets hurt. People who ignored all that should be held accountable for ignoring it. And I'm not sure if the law allows the families of these victims to sue the government, but if they do, lawsuits should be filed. Somebody has to be held accountable for this. But the government also has to change their system. If warning reports come in saying, hey, listen, we have this huge event and there's problems with the huge event, the government has to take it seriously and say, all right, if there's problems, let's go down there, let's figure out how to fix the problems. They have to do that. Failing to do that, they fail their people. Now, I know I said this before, and you've heard me say this before, that when a government doesn't take care of their people and doesn't watch out for the safety of their people, we talk about this with terrorism a lot, when a government doesn't take care of their people, then they're failing their people. They're not a government, and they shouldn't be considered a government. Government's first job is to take care of their citizens. Now, there's another aspect that I haven't talked about, and I think we're going to look at it for just a couple of seconds now. And it's the political aspect of this whole thing. While there were many Arab cities, many Arab people living near Mount Meron that came out and tried to help as much as possible, there were Arabs in the country that were celebrating the deaths of these people. Now, this happens after terrorist attacks. This happened after this event, and is totally unacceptable. And it should be condemned by every rational person alive, including the, I'll use this term very loosely, peace partners, the terrorist Palestinian Authority. They should be condemning this. Instead, they haven't. They refuse to. They even refuse to give condolences for an accident that happened. The Israeli government should take note of this. And I'm not saying revenge, because revenge really doesn't work. But what I am saying is that people should be held accountable for their actions. And that's what this whole show's been about, people being held accountable for their actions. We can't just blame this on God and can't just say this was God's will and this is what happened. There were people who didn't commit actions they should have committed, people who didn't do jobs they should have done, and people who are celebrating the deaths of other people who shouldn't be celebrating. These people should be held accountable for their actions. They should be held accountable for the murder or the death, excuse me, not the murder, the death of these 45 people. They should be held accountable, period. If we don't hold them accountable, then we're going to see other tragedies like this. Very unfortunate if that happens. But we will see other tragedies. If the system doesn't change, God forbid this may happen again. My heart goes out, my sympathies to the families of the victims. May you be comforted amongst the mourners of Zion. And may the memories of everybody who died at Mount Meron on Lag BaOmer be a blessing to all of us. I'll see you again next week.